We are glad to see you again. In this story for you to listen to before you sleep, we will journey through time to witness 7 decisive days that shaped the destiny of Rome. We will see these moments not through dry dates and battles, but through the lives and characters of the remarkable people who made them happen. Settle in, close your eyes, and let our story begin. Our story of Rome begins not in Italy, but in the smoking ruins of a legendary city far to the east. When the mighty city of Troy fell to the Greeks, a hero named Aeneas, a man said to be the son of the goddess Venus herself, escaped the flames. He gathered the survivors and, after years of wandering across the seas, guided by divine prophecy, he landed on the shores of Italy. His destiny was not to rebuild Troy, but to lay the foundation for something far greater. Generations passed. The descendants of Aeneas ruled over a prosperous kingdom called Alba Longa, nestled in the Alban Hills. For many years there was peace, but peace is often a fragile thing, easily shattered by human ambition. The rightful king of Alba Longa was a just and fair man named Numitor. He had a younger brother, Amulius, whose heart was consumed by jealousy and a thirst for power. In a swift and brutal coup, Amulius seized the throne. He killed Numitor's sons, ensuring no legitimate male heirs could challenge him. But there was still Numitor's daughter, the beautiful Rhea Silvia. Amulius, clever and cruel, devised a plan to neutralize this final threat to his rule. He could not simply kill her without angering the gods, so he forced her to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess of the goddess Vesta. The Vestals were sworn to a vow of celibacy for 30 years. By making her a priestess, Amulius believed he had ended Numitor's bloodline forever. His throne was secure. But tyrants often forget to account for the will of the heavens. The god of war himself, Mars, was captivated by Rhea Silvia's beauty. From their union 2 children were born. They were twin boys, strong and healthy, with the fire of their divine father in their eyes. When news of their birth reached Amulius, he was thrown into a rage. His carefully laid plans were in ruins. He saw these 2 infants not as children, but as a future rebellion, a living embodiment of the justice he had defied. He ordered a servant to take the newborns and drown them in the river Tiber. The servant, perhaps with a flicker of pity in his heart, could not bring himself to commit such a direct and monstrous act. The river, as it happened, had flooded its banks, making the main current dangerous and difficult to reach. So, the servant placed the twins into a simple wicker basket and set it afloat in the shallow, calmer waters at the edge of the flood. He assumed the rising water would soon carry the basket into the main current, where the infants would surely perish. He had followed his orders, yet spared himself the sight of their final moments. But fate, or perhaps the gods, had a different plan. The floodwaters began to recede, and the gentle current carried the basket not into the deadly rapids, but towards the shore. It came to rest at the base of a hill, which would one day be known as the Palatine Hill, nestled beneath the sheltering branches of a wild fig tree. The infants, cold and hungry, began to cry. Their cries echoed through the quiet landscape, reaching the ears of a creature of the wild. A she-wolf, driven from her den, was drawn by the sound. But instead of the predator's instinct, a divine compassion guided her. She approached the basket, and seeing the helpless children, she lay down beside them, gently nudging them and offering them her own milk. This was the first miracle. Soon after, a second creature appeared. A woodpecker, a bird sacred to the god Mars, flew down and placed wild berries near the infants' mouths. The sons of the god of war were being nurtured by their father's sacred animals. This incredible scene, a wild beast nursing human children, was witnessed by a simple shepherd in the king's service. His name was Faustulus. He watched in stunned silence, unable to believe his eyes. He understood that this was no ordinary event. These were not ordinary children. He saw the hand of the gods at work and knew he had to act. Carefully, he gathered the twins from the ground, wrapping them in his cloak, and took them to his humble hut. There he and his wife, Laurentia, decided to raise the boys as their own sons. They named them Romulus and Remus. The boys grew up far from the palaces and politics that had defined their birth. They knew nothing of their royal grandfather or their divine father. Their world was one of green pastures, dense forests, and the changing seasons. They were raised not as princes, but as shepherds. This upbringing forged their character in a way no royal court ever could. They learned to be tough, resilient, and self-reliant. They spent their days protecting their flocks from wild animals and their nights sleeping under the stars. They grew strong, swift, and brave, and soon became the natural leaders among the other young shepherds of the region. They were charismatic and decisive, quick to act and fearless in the face of danger. They led their friends on hunts and defended their communities from bands of robbers. They were not just brothers, they were a team, their bond forged in the shared challenges of a simple, rugged life, completely unaware of the extraordinary destiny that awaited them. As the years passed, the bond between Romulus and Remus grew stronger, as did their reputation. They were no longer just boys, but young men, respected and admired by their peers for their courage and their innate sense of fairness. They did not simply command respect, they earned it. When disputes arose among the shepherds, it was Romulus and Remus who were sought out to mediate. When danger threatened, it was they who stood at the forefront. Their lives were simple, yet they were unknowingly being trained for greatness, learning the arts of leadership not in a classroom, but on the rugged hills and in the face of real-world challenges. Their most frequent adversaries were the shepherds of King Amulius himself, who grazed the royal flocks on the nearby Aventine Hill. These men were known for their arrogance and aggression, often trying to drive off other shepherds and seize their pastures. Romulus and Remus refused to be intimidated. They met aggression with strength and cunning, often turning the tables on the king's men and recovering stolen livestock. This constant conflict, while seemingly minor, was a crucible that sharpened their skills and solidified their authority. One day, this rivalry boiled over into a fateful confrontation. The people of the region were preparing for the Lupercalia, a festival of purification and fertility. The king's shepherds, knowing the twins would be occupied with the celebrations, saw an opportunity. They lay in ambush, determined to capture the brothers and put an end to their defiance. A fierce fight broke out. The odds were against them, and while Romulus fought with incredible ferocity, Remus was overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. He was captured and dragged away in chains. The king's men brought their prisoner not to Amulius, but to the deposed king, Numitor. They accused Remus of being a bandit, of raiding Numitor's own lands, a false charge designed to sow discord and curry favor with the old king, who still lived on his private estates under Amulius's watchful eye. As Remus stood before the old man, bound and defiant, Numitor felt a strange stirring in his heart. He looked at the young man's noble bearing, his proud and unbroken spirit, and saw something familiar. He was struck by his age, which seemed to match that of his long-lost grandson's. He decided to question the prisoner in private. Meanwhile, Faustulus the shepherd was gripped by terror. He had always known this day might come. He feared that Remus would be executed, and that the tyrant Amulius would soon discover the existence of his brother, Romulus. The time for secrets was over. He rushed to find Romulus and finally revealed the truth he had guarded for so many years. He told him the entire story, of their mother, Rhea Silvia, of the cruel king Amulius, of their miraculous rescue from the Tiber and their nourishment by the she-wolf. He presented Romulus with a basket in which they had been found, a tangible piece of their past. For Romulus, this revelation was like a lightning strike. The pieces of his life suddenly fell into place. The innate nobility he felt, the drive to lead, the restlessness in his soul, it all made sense. He was not just a shepherd. He was the grandson of a king, the son of a god. But there was no time for contemplation. His brother was in danger. Grief and rage filled his heart, but they were channeled into a cold, clear purpose. He immediately began to rally the other shepherds, his loyal followers. He told them of the injustice of his brother's capture and of the tyranny of Amulius. His words, filled with newfound authority and passion, ignited a fire in their hearts. They armed themselves with clubs and farming tools, ready to follow their leader into the heart of the kingdom. At the same time, within Numitor's estate, the old king was interrogating Remus. He asked about his origins, his family, his life. Remus's answers, honest and direct, only deepened Numitor's suspicion. The young man's character, so unlike that of a common shepherd, spoke of a noble lineage. Numitor was on the verge of recognizing his own blood when a messenger arrived. He brought news that Romulus was marching on the city. The connection was made. Numitor now understood who these young men truly were. He shared the truth with Remus, and the young man who had entered the room as a prisoner now stood as a prince, ready to reclaim his birthright. The plan was simple and swift. Romulus divided his men. He would lead the main force in a direct assault on the palace, creating a diversion. Meanwhile, Remus, now freed and armed by Numitor's household, would lead another group from inside the city, striking from a different direction. When the attack began, the city of Alba Longa was thrown into chaos. The palace guards, caught by surprise, were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the shepherds led by Romulus. As they battled at the gates, Remus and his men emerged from the side streets, and the guards found themselves trapped between two fronts. Romulus fought his way through the palace corridors, his path marked by a singular burning objective: to find the man who had wronged his family. He burst into the throne room and confronted Amulius. The tyrant, who had lived his life by the sword, now faced the consequence. The fight was short. Justice, long delayed, was finally delivered. With the tyrant dead, the brothers rushed to their grandfather. They proclaimed him the rightful king of Alba Longa, restoring him to the throne from which he had been so violently removed. The people of the city, freed from the oppressive rule of Amulius, rejoiced. Justice had been restored. But for Romulus and Remus, this victory was not an end. It was a beginning. They had reclaimed their past, but their active, ambitious natures could not be content with a quiet life in an established city, even one ruled by their own grandfather. Their destiny, forged in the wilderness and proven in battle, now called them to build something new, something of their own. Though justice had been served in Alba Longa, the city felt too small to contain the ambitions of two such men. Romulus and Remus were not born to live in the shadow of another king, not even their own grandfather. A powerful desire drove them to found a city of their own, a city built on the very ground where their lives had been spared. They returned to the banks of the Tiber, to the 7 hills rising from the marshy plains, the place where the she-wolf had found them. Here their story began, and here they decided a new story would be built. But for the first time in their lives, the unbreakable bond between the brothers began to fracture. They, who had faced every danger as one, now found themselves divided by the most fundamental questions. Who would be the king of this new city? And on which hill should it be built? Romulus favored the Palatine Hill. It was the place where the basket had washed ashore, the site of their miraculous salvation. For him, it was sacred ground, blessed by the gods. Remus, however, argued for the nearby Aventine Hill. It was higher, more defensible, and in his eyes, a more practical choice. What began as a simple disagreement soon spiraled into a bitter rivalry. Their shared dream was now a source of conflict, and neither brother was willing to yield to the other. To avoid bloodshed, they agreed to let the gods decide their fate. They would turn to augury, the sacred art of divination, by observing the flight of birds. It was a common and deeply respected practice. The will of the heavens would be revealed in the patterns of the sky. Remus ascended the Aventine Hill, his chosen site, while Romulus climbed the Palatine. They each prepared a sacred space and waited, scanning the skies for a sign. The vigil began. Hours passed under the silent gaze of the sun. Then, a cry of triumph came from the Aventine. Remus had seen the first omen. 6 majestic vultures were circling in the sky above him. He was ecstatic, certain that the gods had chosen him. Messengers were dispatched to declare his victory. But almost as the news began to spread, an even more powerful sign appeared to Romulus on the Palatine. A flight of 12 vultures, double the number, descended from the sky. The dispute, which was meant to be settled, now flared with even greater intensity. A furious argument erupted. Remus claimed victory because the sign had appeared to him first. Priority, he argued, was what mattered. Romulus countered that his sign was clearly superior, for the gods had sent him twice the number of birds. Quantity, he insisted, proved divine favor. The ambiguous omen had not brought clarity. It had only deepened their division. Each brother was convinced that he was the chosen one, and their followers quickly took sides. Romulus, decisive and impatient, chose not to wait for the argument to be resolved. Believing in the strength of his own claim, he proceeded alone. He began the sacred and ancient ritual for founding a city. He yoked a white bull and a white cow to a plow with a bronze blade. Then, he began to carve a deep furrow into the earth around the base of the Palatine Hill. This furrow was not merely a line in the dirt. It was the Pomerium, the sacred and inviolable boundary of the future city. According to tradition, the earth displaced by the plow was thrown inwards, symbolizing the walls that would rise to protect the community. Where a gate was planned, the plow was lifted from the ground, leaving the earth untouched. This was a profoundly religious act, transforming a simple piece of land into a consecrated space, a home for a new people under the protection of the gods. Remus watched from a distance, his heart a storm of jealousy and resentment. He saw his brother's actions as the ultimate betrayal, a flagrant disregard for his own claim. Filled with scorn, he approached the freshly plowed boundary. He scoffed at the low mound of earth and the shallow ditch. "Is this what will protect your new city?" he taunted. And to show his utter contempt for his brother's sacred ritual, he committed a terrible act of sacrilege. He took a running start and contemptuously leaped over the furrow and the mound of earth. In that single moment, a line was crossed from which there was no return. To violate the Pomerium was to defile the sanctity of the city itself, to invite chaos and ill fortune. It was an act of profound impiety. What happened next has been told in 2 ways. Some say it was one of Romulus's most loyal lieutenants who, enraged by the blasphemy, struck Remus down on the spot. But the more common and more chilling version of the story says that it was Romulus himself. Seeing his brother's mockery, his sacred work defiled, Romulus was consumed by a terrible rage. He dropped the plow and rushed at his twin. The brother who had shared his cradle, the boy who had grown up by his side, the man who had fought beside him to restore a king to his throne, now stood before him as an enemy of the gods. He struck Remus down, and as his brother lay dying at his feet, Romulus spoke the terrible words that would echo throughout Roman history. "So shall it be for all who dare to cross my walls." The foundation of the city was laid. Romulus completed the ritual, his hands stained with his brother's blood. He stood as the sole founder, the first king. He gave the city his own name, calling it Rome. It was born of a divine father and nurtured by a wild beast. It was founded through a sacred ritual and christened with the blood of a brother. This act of fratricide, committed at the very moment of its birth, would cast a long dark shadow over the city's destiny, a chilling prophecy of the civil wars and internal strife that would one day tear the Republic apart. Centuries pass. The small city founded by Romulus has grown beyond its sacred walls, beyond the 7 hills. It is no longer a kingdom, but a republic, a formidable power whose legions have conquered the entire Italian peninsula. But as Rome's influence spread, it came face to face with another great power, a rival across the sea. This was Carthage, a sprawling mercantile empire on the coast of North Africa. Unlike Rome, which was built on legions and land, Carthage was built on ships and trade. For decades, these two titans clashed in a brutal conflict known as the First Punic War. In the end, Rome emerged victorious. Carthage was forced to accept a humiliating peace, surrendering its territories in Sicily and paying a crushing indemnity. In Carthage, the defeat was a bitter pill to swallow, but for one man, it was an unforgivable insult. His name was Hamilcar Barca, Carthage's greatest general. He had fought the Romans to a standstill in Sicily, a brilliant commander who had never been defeated in a major battle. But he was betrayed not by the enemy, but by his own government, a council of wealthy merchants who chose to sue for peace rather than continue funding the war. Hamilcar returned home with a heart full of smoldering resentment. He believed that Carthage had not been defeated, but had simply given up. And he swore that one day, he would make Rome pay for its victory. His tool for this revenge would be his own son, Hannibal. The story, passed down through generations, is one of the most powerful in all of history. Hamilcar was preparing to lead an army to Spain, a land rich in silver and manpower, which he intended to use to rebuild Carthaginian strength for a future war. His son, Hannibal, then only 9 years old, begged to go with him. Hamilcar looked at his young son, seeing the fire and ambition in his eyes. He agreed, but on one condition. He led the boy into a sacred temple, to an altar where sacrifices were made to the gods. He ordered the attendants to stand back, leaving him and his son alone before the divine presence. He then instructed Hannibal to place his small hand upon the sacrificial offering and to repeat an oath after him. There, in the solemn silence of the temple, the 9-year-old boy swore a sacred and terrible vow, that as long as he lived, he would never be a friend to Rome. He would be its eternal enemy. This oath became the guiding principle of Hannibal's life. It was a poison that fueled a lifetime of war, a promise that shaped him into the single greatest threat the Roman Republic would ever face. He did not grow up in the decadent luxury of Carthage. His home was the military camp. His education was in strategy and tactics. His childhood spent among the hardened veterans who had served under his father. He learned to endure the same hardships as the common soldier, to sleep on the cold ground wrapped in a military cloak, to eat the same simple rations. He learned from his father not only how to fight, but how to lead. He became a master of psychology, able to understand the motivations of his enemies and the hearts of his own men. He spoke multiple languages, allowing him to command a diverse mercenary army of Spaniards, Gauls, and Numidians, not through fear, but through genuine loyalty. His men adored him because they saw that he was one of them. He was always the first to enter a battle and the last to leave. He shared their dangers, their hunger, and their victories. This upbringing forged a leader of unparalleled charisma and military genius. When his father Hamilcar fell in battle, command passed to his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. Hannibal served as his brilliant subordinate, honing his skills. But when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army did not wait for orders from Carthage. By unanimous and enthusiastic acclaim, the soldiers themselves raised Hannibal to the position of commander-in-chief. He was only 26 years old. The weapon that Hamilcar had spent his life forging was now complete. In Hannibal, Carthage had a leader who possessed his father's strategic mind, but with even greater tactical brilliance and a burning personal hatred for Rome. He now commanded a large, veteran army that was fiercely loyal to him and him alone. Standing in Spain, looking north towards the mountain ranges that separated him from Italy, Hannibal remembered the oath he had made as a child. The time for vengeance was finally at hand. Hannibal did not wait for Rome to act. He would choose the time and place for his war. His target was the city of Saguntum, a prosperous port on the Spanish coast. Saguntum was an ally of Rome, a piece on the strategic chessboard that Hannibal knew he could not leave behind. He laid siege to the city, a deliberate and calculated act of provocation. He was throwing down a challenge, forcing the Roman Senate to either abandon its ally or declare war. For 8 grueling months, the people of Saguntum resisted with desperate courage, but in the end, their city fell. Hannibal showed no mercy. The news of Saguntum's fall sent a shockwave through Rome. The Senate, which had viewed Hannibal as a distant problem, was now forced to confront his audacity. They dispatched an embassy to Carthage, delivering a simple ultimatum: surrender Hannibal to us for judgment, or there will be war. The Carthaginian council hesitated, but Hannibal had already set events in motion that they could not control. The ultimatum was rejected. The Second Punic War had begun. The Romans expected a predictable war. They assumed Hannibal would fight them in Spain, or perhaps attempt a naval invasion. They prepared their legions for a conventional conflict, underestimating the mind of their new enemy. For Hannibal had no intention of fighting a war on Rome's terms. He had conceived a plan so audacious, so daring, that no Roman commander could have possibly anticipated it. He would not sail to Italy. He would march. He would take his army, including his famed war elephants, over the massive snow-capped barrier of the Alps and descend into Italy from the north, where Rome was least prepared to defend itself. He gathered his army of nearly 100,000 men. He looked out at the faces of Libyans, Spaniards, and Gauls, and delivered a speech that would become legend. He told them they were not merely fighting for Carthage, but for glory and revenge. He painted a picture of Italy, a land of rich fields and wealthy cities, all theirs for the taking. He spoke of the Romans not as invincible masters, but as arrogant tyrants who deserved to be humbled. His charisma was magnetic. He ignited a fire in his men, transforming a mercenary army into a unified force driven by a singular purpose. The march began. The first great obstacle was the Pyrenees Mountains, separating Spain from Gaul. Here, Hannibal fought his way through hostile local tribes, suffering his first losses but securing his path forward. Next came the mighty Rhone River. The Romans had a fleet nearby, but Hannibal's speed and ingenuity outpaced them. He commissioned the construction of massive rafts, covered them with earth to trick his elephants into thinking they were on solid ground, and ferried his entire army, animals and all, across the wide, fast-flowing river before the Romans even knew what was happening. But these challenges were merely a prelude. Ahead of them loomed the Alps, a terrifying wall of rock and ice that scraped the sky. It was late autumn, and the first snows had already begun to fall. No army of this size, with cavalry and elephants, had ever attempted such a crossing. His own officers advised against it, calling it madness. But Hannibal's will was absolute. The ascent was a living nightmare. The narrow mountain paths were treacherous, slick with ice. A single misstep meant a fall of thousands of feet into a rocky abyss. Men and pack animals were lost daily. Worse still were the local mountain tribes, fierce and independent peoples who saw Hannibal's army as invaders. They launched constant guerrilla attacks, rolling massive boulders down from the cliffs onto the struggling column of soldiers below, causing chaos and panic. Throughout this ordeal, Hannibal was everywhere. He was not a general commanding from the rear. He was on the front lines, scouting ahead for safe passages. He was in the middle of the column, rallying the flagging spirits of his men, sharing their meager rations and their exposure to the biting cold. He suffered as they suffered, and they loved him for it. His presence was a constant source of strength, a reminder of the oath that drove them all forward. After 9 days of brutal climbing, they reached the summit. The view was both breathtaking and heartbreaking. Below them, stretching out as far as the eye could see, was the green and fertile land of Italy. But around them was a scene of devastation. Thousands of his men lay dead on the mountain slopes behind them. The army was exhausted, half frozen, and on the verge of starvation. Morale was at its breaking point. It was here that Hannibal demonstrated his true genius as a leader. He gathered his surviving officers and soldiers on a high promontory that offered a clear view of the Po Valley. He pointed south, his arm outstretched. "My friends," he declared, "you are now climbing over the walls not of Italy but of Rome itself. The land you see before you is your reward. A few more battles, and the capital of this arrogant empire will be in your hands." His words, his unshakable confidence, were like a fire in the frozen hearts of his men. He transformed their despair into renewed hope. The 15-day journey through the Alps had been catastrophic. He had started with nearly 100,000 men. Now barely 25,000 remained. Most of his elephants had perished. He had arrived in Italy with a ghost of an army. But it was an army of survivors. They were hardened veterans, forged in the crucible of the mountains, and bound by a fanatical devotion to the commander who had led them through hell and delivered them to the doorstep of their enemy. Rome had no idea what was coming. When Hannibal's ragged army descended from the Alps into the plains of northern Italy, the Romans were initially dismissive. They saw a depleted force, weakened by its journey, and sent their legions north with confidence, expecting to crush the invaders easily. They had profoundly misjudged their opponent. In 2 successive battles, at the river Trebia and then at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal inflicted devastating defeats on the Roman armies. He used the terrain, the weather, and his superior cavalry to utterly outmaneuver the disciplined but inflexible Roman legions. The battle at Lake Trasimene was a massacre, an ambush so perfectly executed that an entire consular army was annihilated. Panic gripped the city of Rome. For the first time, its citizens understood the nature of the man who was now marching through their homeland. This was not just another war. It was a struggle for survival. In response, the Republic took an unprecedented step. It raised the largest single army in its history. By some estimates, nearly 80,000 infantry and over 6,000 cavalry. It was a colossal force, the embodiment of Roman power, designed to find Hannibal and crush him through sheer weight of numbers. But this mighty army had a fatal flaw, one rooted in the very fabric of the Roman political system. Command was not given to one man, but was shared between the 2 elected consuls for that year, who were to alternate command on a daily basis. And in this critical year, the 2 men chosen could not have been more different in temperament and strategy. The first was Lucius Aemilius Paulus. He was an experienced patrician, a man from an old aristocratic family. He was cautious, methodical, and deeply respected the danger Hannibal represented. Having studied Hannibal's previous victories, Paulus understood that facing him in an open-field battle was exactly what the Carthaginian general wanted. He advocated a strategy of patience. Shadow Hannibal's army, cut off his supplies, and exhaust him, but avoid a direct, all-out confrontation. His co-consul was Gaius Terentius Varro. Varro was the complete opposite. He was a new man, a plebeian who had risen through the ranks on a wave of popular support. He was energetic, arrogant, and deeply impatient. He viewed Paulus's caution as cowardice. Varro was a politician who needed a glorious victory to secure his legacy, and he promised the people of Rome that he would deliver it. He argued that their massive army was invincible and that a single decisive blow was all that was needed to destroy Hannibal once and for all. Their personal animosity reflected the deep social and political divisions within Rome itself, the cautious patrician establishment versus the ambitious and aggressive popular faction. Hannibal, a master psychologist, watched this division with keen interest. He understood the Roman mindset, their pride, and their thirst for battlefield glory. He knew that if he could provoke them, the impatient nature of Varro would eventually win out over the caution of Paulus. He marched his army south to a small supply depot near the town of Cannae, a wide, flat, dusty plain, perfect for his superior cavalry. It was a deliberate invitation to battle. The Roman army arrived and set up camp. As the days passed, the tension between the two consuls grew. Paulus urged restraint, pointing out the unsuitability of the flat terrain for the Roman legions. Varro accused him of fear, his rhetoric stirring up the soldiers who were eager for a fight. Finally, the fateful day arrived. It was Varro's turn to command. He ordered the army to form up for battle. Varro's plan was brutally simple. He would use his overwhelming numerical advantage in infantry to punch a hole straight through the center of Hannibal's line. To achieve this, he abandoned the traditional flexible Roman formation, the manipular system, and instead massed his legions into a gigantic, deep phalanx. It was a human battering ram, designed for one purpose: to smash the enemy with irresistible force. The weaker Roman cavalry was placed on the wings to provide protection. Hannibal watched the Romans form up, and he must have smiled. Varro was doing exactly what he had hoped. He responded with a formation that seemed to the Romans like madness. In the center of his line, directly opposing the Roman battering ram, he placed his weakest troops, the Gauls and Spaniards, and he arranged them not in a straight line, but in a shallow crescent, bulging outwards towards the Romans. It looked like a fragile, inviting target. On the flanks of this weak center, set back in deep columns, he positioned his best troops, the hardened African veterans. And on the wings, he concentrated his greatest strength, his superb Carthaginian and Numidian cavalry. The battle began. The massive Roman center surged forward, a deafening roar of 80,000 men. Just as Varro had planned, they crashed into Hannibal's thin crescent of Gauls and Spaniards. Under the immense pressure, the Carthaginian center began to give way. Step by step, they were forced backwards, fighting desperately. From the Roman perspective, it was the beginning of a great victory. They pushed deeper and deeper, their ranks becoming more and more compressed as they funneled into the collapsing enemy line. The crescent that had bulged outwards now sagged inwards, forming a deep U-shape, a sack. The Romans, in their eagerness, were marching themselves willingly into a trap. At that moment, the trap was sprung. On the wings, Hannibal's superior cavalry, led by his brother Hasdrubal, shattered the weaker Roman cavalry and drove them from the field. But instead of pursuing them, they executed a brilliant maneuver, circling around the back of the entire Roman army. Simultaneously, as the Roman legions were drawn deep into the sack, Hannibal gave the signal to his elite African infantry who had been waiting patiently on the flanks. They turned inwards and slammed into the exposed sides of the overextended Roman formation. In a matter of minutes, the unstoppable Roman assault column had become a surrounded, helpless mob. The cavalry closed the trap from the rear. The Roman army was encircled. What followed was not a battle, but an industrial-scale slaughter. Packed so tightly together that many could not even lift their arms to swing their swords, the Roman soldiers could do little but die. The consul Paulus, wounded early in the battle, fought on foot until he was cut down. Varro, the architect of the disaster, managed to cut his way out with a small group of cavalry and escape. By the end of the day, the field of Cannae was covered with the bodies of 50 to 70,000 Roman soldiers. Hannibal had lost less than 6,000 men. It was the darkest day in Roman history, a military catastrophe born from the clash between one general's strategic genius and another's arrogant, reckless ambition. As the sun set on the plains of Cannae, it illuminated a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The scale of the victory was absolute. Hannibal's officers, riding through the field of carnage, were in awe. They had not just defeated Rome, they had annihilated its power. The path to the city itself now lay open and undefended. His commanders gathered around him, their faces flushed with triumph. Among them was Hannibal, the brilliant commander of his Numidian cavalry, the man whose charge had sealed the encirclement. He urged Hannibal to act immediately. "Let me ride ahead with the cavalry," he pleaded. "Follow me with the infantry. In 5 days, you will be dining in the capital." He saw the moment for what it was, a singular opportunity to strike the final mortal blow. But Hannibal was silent. He stood, looking over the battlefield, his mind weighing options that no one else could see. He congratulated Hannibal on his zeal, but said he needed time to consider such a momentous step. It was then that Hannibal, in a fit of frustration, spoke the words that would haunt Hannibal for the rest of history. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal," he declared, "but you do not know how to use one." Hannibal's hesitation has been debated by historians for over 2,000 years. Was it the greatest strategic blunder in military history? Why did he not march on Rome? The decision was not born of fear, but of cold, hard calculation. Hannibal was a brilliant tactician, but he was also a pragmatist. His army, though victorious, was exhausted and had suffered its own losses. He had no heavy siege equipment, the catapults and towers necessary to break through Rome's formidable defensive walls. A direct assault would likely fail, turning his stunning victory into a grinding, costly siege for which he was unprepared. Furthermore, Hannibal's ultimate strategy was not to physically destroy the city of Rome. His goal was political. He believed that the Roman Republic was not a unified nation, but a confederation of Italian states held together by force. He was convinced that after a catastrophic defeat like Cannae, Rome's allies, the Samnites, the Campanians, the Greeks in the south, would see that Rome could no longer protect them. They would abandon the Republic and flock to his side. He intended to dismantle the Roman alliance system piece by piece, isolating the city until it was forced to sue for peace on his terms. He chose to wait, to send out messengers with news of his victory, expecting the political structure of Italy to crumble before him. It was a sound strategy, based on a logical assessment of power. But in this, Hannibal made his one fatal miscalculation. He had understood the Roman army, but he had not truly understood the Roman character. As news of the disaster trickled back to the city, it was met with a wave of terror and grief unlike any it had ever known. Every family had lost a son, a brother, or a father. The city was defenseless. If Hannibal had appeared over the hills, the gates might well have been thrown open in surrender. But he did not come. And in that brief window of time, something incredible happened. The Roman spirit, which had been broken, began to harden. The Senate, led by men of iron, will like Quintus Fabius Maximus, the man who had long advocated avoiding battle, seized control. Their response was not one of panic, but of grim, unyielding resolve. They passed emergency decrees. First, public mourning was forbidden. The sounds of weeping were silenced. Rome would not show its enemy any sign of weakness. Second, they refused to even consider the idea of peace. When Hannibal sent a delegation of captured Roman officers to negotiate their ransom, the Senate, in a stunning act of defiance, refused to even receive them. They passed a decree stating that Rome had no need for soldiers who had allowed themselves to be captured alive. This sent a brutal message to Hannibal and to their own people. There would be no negotiation. There was only victory or death. Third, they began to rebuild their army from nothing. With the entire male population of fighting age seemingly wiped out, they lowered the enlistment age to 17. They freed 8,000 slaves and armed them, promising them freedom and citizenship in exchange for their service. They emptied the temples of the weapons of their ancestors, trophies from past wars, and pressed them into the hands of new recruits. Within a short time, Rome had scraped together new legions, inexperienced and poorly equipped, but filled with a burning desire for revenge. Hannibal had won the greatest battle of his age, but he had already lost the war. His victory at Cannae did not break the Roman Republic. It forged it into something stronger. The catastrophe burned away the political infighting and the arrogance that had led to the disaster. In its place was a silent, unified, and utterly ruthless determination to survive and to win at any cost. Hannibal would remain in Italy for more than a decade, a master of a battlefield that no Roman general dared to enter, but he would never again come so close to final victory. The walls he had failed to storm were not made of stone, but of the indomitable will of the Roman people. More than a century has passed since the dark days of Cannae. Rome did not just survive Hannibal, it triumphed. Carthage was utterly destroyed, its fields sown with salt. The legions marched on, conquering Greece, North Africa, and much of Spain. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But its external victories had created a profound internal crisis. The vast wealth pouring in from conquered provinces corrupted the political system, widening the gap between the fabulously rich and the desperately poor. The old republic, designed to govern a small city-state, was breaking under the strain of managing a global empire. The city of Rome became a battleground for two powerful factions. On one side were the Optimates, the best men, a conservative faction of the Senate representing the interests of the old aristocratic families. They sought to preserve the traditional power structures of the Republic. On the other side were the Populars, the men of the people. They were often aristocrats themselves, but they used popular assemblies and the support of the urban masses to challenge the Senate's authority, championing issues like land reform and debt relief. It was an age of turmoil, political violence, and larger-than-life personalities. Into this turbulent world, a boy named Gaius Julius Caesar was born. He belonged to the Julian clan, one of the oldest patrician families in Rome. The Julii traced their lineage back to the city's mythical origins, claiming direct descent from Aeneas, and through him from the goddess Venus herself. It was a heritage of immense prestige, a connection to the very divine roots of Rome. Yet, for all their ancient lineage, Caesar's immediate family was not particularly wealthy or influential. They were aristocrats by name, but not by power. Caesar's character was forged in the fires of a brutal civil war. His Aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, a celebrated general and the leader of the Populars. Marius was a new man who had opened the ranks of the legions to landless citizens, creating professional armies that were more loyal to their generals than to the state. His great rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the champion of the Optimates. Their conflict plunged Rome into a bloodbath. When Caesar was a teenager, Sulla returned from a war in the east, marched his army on Rome, and declared himself dictator. He then unleashed a terrifying wave of purges known as the proscriptions. Lists of his political enemies were posted in the forum. Anyone on the list could be killed with impunity, and the man who brought his head to Sulla would receive a reward. Their property was confiscated by the state and auctioned off to Sulla's supporters. It was a time of terror, where old scores were settled and fortunes were made overnight on the blood of fellow citizens. Because of his connection to Marius, the young Caesar was immediately in danger. Sulla ordered him to divorce his wife, Cornelia, who was the daughter of one of Marius's key allies. It was a test of loyalty. Divorcing her would mean severing his ties to the losing faction and pledging allegiance to the new dictator. For a young man with his life and career ahead of him, it was the sensible thing to do. But Caesar refused. In an astonishing act of defiance for a boy of only 18, he openly disobeyed the most powerful man in Rome. It was a decision that could have and should have cost him his life. Sulla, furious, added Caesar's name to the proscription lists. Caesar was forced to flee the city, his inheritance confiscated, his life forfeit. He spent months in hiding, moving from place to place, constantly on the run from Sulla's assassins. Eventually, Influential relatives intervened on his behalf, begging the dictator to spare the boy's life. Sulla, with great reluctance, finally agreed. But as he granted the pardon, he uttered a chillingly prophetic warning to his followers who had pleaded for Caesar. "Very well, you win," he said. "But know this, in this boy Caesar I see many a Marius." He saw in the young man's defiant eyes the same boundless ambition that had driven his old rival. The experience taught Caesar invaluable lessons. He learned that fortune was fickle, that power could be won and lost in an instant, and that survival often depended on audacity and risk. He had looked into the face of absolute power and refused to bow. Having escaped death, he left Rome and joined the army in the eastern provinces, where he began his military career. He quickly distinguished himself, earning the civic crown, Rome's second highest military honor, for saving the life of a fellow soldier in battle. Even as a young man, his charisma and courage were undeniable. He was building a reputation, but his ambition was aimed at a much greater prize, Rome itself. He was waiting for his moment, for Sulla to pass from the scene, so that he could return and claim the destiny he believed was his by birthright. When Sulla finally died, Caesar returned to Rome. He was ambitious and charismatic, but he faced a significant obstacle. He had no money. In Rome, politics was a rich man's game. Campaigns for public office required enormous sums to host lavish games for the people and to bribe voters. Caesar, with his confiscated inheritance, could not compete on these terms. So he chose a different path. He began his career as a prosecuting advocate in the law courts, targeting corrupt governors and allies of Sulla. His powerful oratory and attacks on the establishment quickly won him a reputation as a champion of the people, a rising star in the populace faction. He began to climb the cursus honorum, the traditional sequence of public offices. To fund his rise, he borrowed money on a staggering scale. He was betting on himself, taking on crippling debts with the expectation that future positions and conquests would pay them off. Many in the Senate saw him as a reckless and dangerous upstart, but the common people of Rome adored him. He had a natural charm and an easy way with them, and they saw in him a man who would fight for their interests against the entrenched aristocracy. Caesar understood that charisma alone was not enough. To reach the pinnacle of power, the consulship, he needed to break the Senate's unified opposition to him. To do this, he engineered one of the most brilliant political alliances in history. He approached the two most powerful men in Rome, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known as Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey was Rome's most celebrated general, a military hero who had conquered vast territories in the east. But the Senate, jealous of his popularity, had refused to ratify his settlements or grant land to his veteran soldiers. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, a tycoon who had made his fortune during Sulla's proscriptions. He craved the military glory that Pompey possessed. These two men were bitter rivals and disliked each other intensely. Caesar did the impossible. He reconciled them. He convinced them that they were stronger together. By pooling their resources, Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's wealth, and Caesar's immense popularity with the people, they could overcome the Senate's opposition and control the state. This informal alliance became known as the First Triumvirate, a secret pact between three men to dominate Roman politics. The alliance was incredibly effective. With the backing of Pompey and Crassus, Caesar was easily elected consul. During his year in office, he pushed through legislation that favored his allies, granting Pompey's veterans their land and giving Crassus's business associates lucrative tax contracts. He governed with an iron will, often ignoring the Senate and using the popular assemblies to pass his laws. He had made many powerful enemies, and he knew that as soon as his term as consul ended, they would prosecute him for his high-handed methods. He needed protection. For a Roman politician, the ultimate protection was the command of a province, a proconsulship, which granted legal immunity and, more importantly, command of an army. Through his political maneuvering, Caesar secured for himself an extraordinary 5-year command over not one, but 3 provinces: Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. His enemies in the Senate were delighted. They saw it as a way to get this troublesome demagogue out of the city. They hoped he would either be forgotten by the people or, better yet, killed in some skirmish with a barbarian tribe. They had no idea they were handing him the very tool he would use to master the world. The land known as Gaul, which is modern-day France, was not a unified country. It was a chaotic patchwork of hundreds of fiercely independent and warlike Celtic tribes. When Caesar arrived, his official mission was simply to defend the existing Roman province. But Caesar had far grander ambitions. Over the next decade, he would use a combination of brilliant diplomacy, lightning-fast military campaigns, and ruthless brutality to systematically conquer the entirety of Gaul. This was not just a war of conquest. It was the forging of a legend. Caesar proved himself to be a military genius on par with Alexander the Great or Hannibal. His legions marched faster and fought harder than any army Rome had ever produced. He built bridges over the Rhine in a matter of days to campaign in Germany. He even launched 2 expeditions to the mysterious, fog-shrouded island of Britain. Crucially, Caesar was a master of propaganda. Throughout his campaigns, he wrote his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic War. Written in a clear, concise, and seemingly objective third-person style, these accounts were sent back to Rome and circulated among the public. In reality, they were a masterful work of political self-promotion. They portrayed Caesar as a brilliant, decisive, and merciful commander, forced into one conflict after another by treacherous Gallic tribes, always fighting in defense of Rome's interests. He became a living legend. While other politicians were squabbling in the Forum, Caesar was conquering new lands and adding vast territories to the empire. The Gallic Wars were also immensely profitable. Caesar plundered the wealth of Gaul, selling hundreds of thousands of captives into slavery. He became one of the richest men in Rome, able to pay off his colossal debts and fund his political machine back in the city. But his greatest prize was his army. After 10 years of constant warfare under his personal command, his legions were a hardened, professional fighting force, the best in the world. And their loyalty was not to the Senate or the people of Rome. Their loyalty was to one man and one man alone: Caesar, the general who had led them to victory after victory and made them all rich. He now possessed what every Roman strongman craved: a private army, a vast fortune, and the unwavering adoration of the people. In the eyes of the Senate, he had become too powerful, too popular, and too dangerous. The stage was set for the greatest civil war in Roman history. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, the political landscape in Rome was shifting beneath his feet. The first triumvirate, the powerful 3-man alliance that had dominated the Republic, began to crumble. The first blow was the death of Marcus Crassus. Seeking the military glory that had always eluded him, he led an army east against the Parthian Empire and was killed in a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Cannae. Crassus, the great financier, had been the political glue holding the 2 military titans, Caesar and Pompey, together. With him gone, there was nothing to buffer their immense egos and ambitions. The second blow was more personal and perhaps more profound. Caesar's beloved daughter Julia, who was married to Pompey, died in childbirth. Their marriage had been a political arrangement, but a genuine affection had grown between Julia and her husband. Her death severed the last remaining family tie that bound the 2 most powerful men in Rome. They were no longer allies or family. They were simply rivals. Pompey remained in Rome, growing increasingly wary of Caesar's spectacular success. He had long been considered Rome's greatest general, but now Caesar's achievements in Gaul were beginning to eclipse his own. The Senate, which had once feared Pompey, now saw him as the lesser of 2 evils. They began to court him, seeing in him their only hope of reigning in the popular and dangerously powerful governor of Gaul. Jealousy and fear are powerful motivators, and Pompey allowed himself to be drawn into the Senate's camp. He became the champion of the Optimates, the very faction he had once challenged. The final confrontation was now inevitable. Caesar's term as governor was coming to an end. He knew that the moment he gave up command of his army and returned to Rome as a private citizen, his enemies would pounce. They would levy a barrage of lawsuits against him for his actions as consul and for waging unauthorized wars. His career would be destroyed, his wealth confiscated, and he would likely be forced into exile. His only hope was to run for a second consulship while still in command of his province, which would grant him continued legal immunity. But the Senate, with Pompey's backing, blocked this move. Finally, they delivered their ultimatum. The Senate passed a decree ordering Caesar to disband his army immediately and return to Rome. To refuse would be an act of treason. Caesar was trapped. His enemies had backed him into a corner, leaving him with two choices, each one terrible in its own way: obey and face certain political and personal ruin, or disobey and plunge the Roman world into a civil war. In the winter of 49 BC, Caesar led a single legion, the 13th, to a small river called the Rubicon. This river marked the sacred legal boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and the homeland of Italy. Under Roman law, it was forbidden for any general to cross this river with an army. To do so was an explicit declaration of war against the state. Legend says that Caesar paused on the northern bank, tormented by the gravity of his decision. He knew that to cross this stream was to step past a point of no return, to unleash chaos and bloodshed upon the republic he claimed to love. After a period of intense deliberation, he gave the order to advance, uttering the immortal words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. He had made his choice. The Senate and Pompey were caught completely off guard by the speed of his advance. They had expected him to negotiate, to hesitate. They never anticipated his sheer audacity. As Caesar marched south through Italy, city after city opened its gates to him without a fight. He was not seen as an invader, but as a returning hero. Panicked and with his own legions scattered across the provinces, Pompey made a fateful decision. He abandoned Italy, fleeing east to Greece with the majority of the Senate, intending to raise a massive army to retake the peninsula later. Caesar secured Italy in a mere 60 days without any significant bloodshed. He then turned his astonishing speed, his famous Celeritas, first to Spain, where he defeated Pompey's legions in a brilliant campaign, and then to Greece for the final showdown. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar, though heavily outnumbered, won a decisive victory. Pompey once again fled, this time to Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary. Instead, the advisors to the young Egyptian king, hoping to curry favor with the victor, had him assassinated as he stepped ashore. Caesar was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. Over the next few years, he mopped up the remaining pockets of resistance, famously summarizing one swift victory with the three words, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He returned to Rome not just as a victorious general, but as an absolute ruler. He was granted unprecedented powers. He was made consul for 10 years. Finally, in 44 BC, he was given a new title, one that had never existed before: Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for life. To the Roman people, who had driven out their last king 5 centuries earlier, the idea of a permanent, unelected ruler, no matter his title, sounded dangerously like a monarchy. Caesar was at the height of his power, but in accepting this final, fatal honor, he had sealed his own doom. As the absolute master of Rome, Caesar was not a bloody tyrant in the mold of Sulla. On the contrary, he embarked on a breathtaking series of reforms aimed at stabilizing the broken republic. He launched massive public works projects to create jobs for the poor. He reformed the corrupted calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with minor adjustments, we still use today. He planned new conquests and grand architectural projects. And most remarkably, he practiced a policy of unprecedented clemency. He systematically pardoned the very men who had fought against him in the civil war, restoring their property and welcoming them back into the Senate. He seemed to be everything Rome needed, a strong, benevolent, and forward-thinking leader. But in the marble halls of the Senate, among the members of the old aristocratic families, his every move was viewed with suspicion and growing horror. The problem was not his actions, but his status. The title, Dictator for life, was an abomination. For 500 years, the guiding principle of the Roman Republic had been the absolute rejection of one-man rule. The very word king, rex in Latin, was the most toxic insult in their political vocabulary. It was a cultural trauma, a deep-seated fear born from the overthrow of their last tyrannical king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. The man who had led that ancient rebellion was Lucius Junius Brutus, a national hero and the symbolic father of the Republic. Now, centuries later, Caesar was behaving exactly like a king, whether he used the title or not. His statue was placed among those of the gods. His image, for the first time in Roman history, was struck on coins while he was still alive. He controlled the treasury, commanded all armies, and treated the Senate not as a governing partner, but as a rubber stamp for his own decrees. To many senators, it seemed that all the blood spilled in the civil wars had not been to save the Republic, but to crown a new monarch. This fear began to coalesce into a conspiracy. It attracted more than 60 senators, a diverse group of men with a variety of motives. Some were driven by pure envy. Others were old enemies whom Caesar had pardoned, but who could never forgive their own humiliation. The driving force and chief organizer of the plot was a senator named Gaius Cassius Longinus. Cassius was a grim, pragmatic, and intensely proud man who held a deep personal animosity towards Caesar. He was the engine of the conspiracy, but he knew he lacked the public prestige to be its face. The plot needed a symbol, a name that could give their violent act the appearance of a noble patriotic duty. There was only one man who fit that role. His name was Marcus Junius Brutus. He was a direct descendant, it was believed, of that same Lucius Junius Brutus who had expelled the kings 500 years before. His very name was a living monument to the Republic. But Brutus was no natural assassin. He was a quiet, scholarly man, a student of philosophy, deeply immersed in the principles of Stoicism, which taught duty, virtue, and self-control. His personal relationship with Caesar was profoundly complicated. Brutus's mother, Servilia, had been Caesar's longtime mistress. This affair was so famous in Rome that it was rumored Caesar might even be Brutus's biological father, though this is unlikely. What is certain is that Caesar held a deep and paternal affection for Brutus. In the Civil War, Brutus had chosen to fight on the side of Pompey and the Senate. After the defeat at Pharsalus, Caesar not only pardoned him but welcomed him into his inner circle, promoting him to high office. He trusted Brutus completely. For Cassius and the other conspirators, winning Brutus to their cause was essential. They began a subtle and relentless campaign to poison his mind. They did not appeal to his ambition or his greed, for he had little of either. They appealed to his two greatest vulnerabilities, his sense of honor and his famous ancestry. Cassius would ask him, "What has become of the principles of your great ancestor? Do you not see what is happening?" At night, anonymous messages were left on Brutus's official chair in the Senate reading, "You are asleep, Brutus," and "You are not a true Brutus." They were calling his very identity into question, challenging him to live up to the legacy of his name. Brutus was thrown into a state of profound internal conflict. He was torn between two competing loyalties. On one side was his personal duty to Caesar, a man who had shown him nothing but kindness and friendship. On the other was his philosophical and ancestral duty to the Roman Republic, an ideal he believed was being slowly strangled to death. To a Stoic like Brutus, the choice was an agonizing exercise in moral reasoning. If Caesar truly was becoming a king, then was it not the highest duty of a virtuous Roman to stop him? Did the life of one man, even a friend, outweigh the liberty of millions? The final push may have come during the festival of Lupercalia. During the public celebrations, Caesar's loyal subordinate, Mark Antony, attempted to place a royal diadem on Caesar's head. Caesar refused it, and the crowd roared with approval. But the act itself was a test, a public gauging of opinion, and to the conspirators, it was a clear sign of Caesar's ultimate ambition. Sometime after this, Brutus finally made his decision. He would join the conspiracy. In his mind, he was not committing murder. He was performing a sacrifice. He was not killing a friend. He was killing a tyrant, or rather a man who was about to become one. He convinced himself that this was not a sordid political assassination, but a noble and necessary act of tyrannicide to save the soul of Rome. With the weight of his name and his moral authority now behind the plot, the conspiracy gained a fatal momentum. The conspirators set a date and a place for their sacrifice. The stage was now set for the Ides of March. The date chosen for the assassination was the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month. On this day, a Senate meeting was scheduled to be held, not in the traditional Senate house, but in a large hall adjoining the theater of Pompeii. The irony was profound. Caesar was to be struck down at the feet of a towering statue of his great rival, the very man he had defeated to become master of Rome. On the morning of the Ides, a sense of dark foreboding hung over the city. The universe itself seemed to be sending warnings. For days, strange omens had been reported, and the night before, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, was tormented by a terrible nightmare. She dreamt that the roof of their house collapsed and that she was holding the body of her murdered husband in her arms. She woke up in terror and begged him not to go to the Senate that day. Caesar himself was a man who typically dismissed superstition, but even he was unsettled. He was not feeling well, and the official sacrifices he performed that morning yielded horrifyingly bad omens. The priests reported that a sacrificial animal had been found to have no heart. Troubled by the omens and moved by his wife's desperate pleas, Caesar began to waver. He considered postponing the meeting. The fate of the world hung in the balance, resting on this one man's decision to stay home. The conspirators, waiting for him at the Senate, grew anxious as the morning wore on. They feared their plot had been discovered. One of them, a man named Decimus Brutus, who was so close to Caesar that he was named in his will as a secondary heir, took matters into his own hands. He went to Caesar's house personally. Seeing Caesar's hesitation, he used the dictator's own pride against him. He scoffed gently at the superstitions. "Great Caesar," he said, "will you, a man of your stature, allow yourself to be governed by a woman's dream and the foolish omens of priests? The Senate is waiting to honor you. Are you going to send a message telling them to come back when Calpurnia has better dreams?" The subtle mockery hit its mark. Ashamed of his momentary weakness, Caesar set aside his fears. He stood up and agreed to go. He had placed his trust in a man who was leading him to his death. As he made his way through the crowded streets towards the theater of Pompeii, fate made two final attempts to save him. He passed the soothsayer Spurina, the very man who had warned him weeks before to beware the Ides of March. Seeing him, Caesar called out mockingly, "The Ides of March have come." The soothsayer replied with quiet gravity, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." A little further on, a Greek teacher named Artemidorus, who had learned of the conspiracy, pushed his way through the crowd. He thrust a small scroll into Caesar's hand, telling him to read it at once, for it contained matters of life and death. The scroll held a detailed list of all the conspirators and their entire plan. But Caesar, distracted by the throng of petitioners around him, simply added it to the pile of other scrolls to be read later. He walked into the Senate hall holding the proof of his own murder, unread, in his hand. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators moved in, surrounding him under the pretense of supporting a petition. The prearranged signal was given by a senator named Tullius Cimber. He grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders. "This is violence," Caesar cried out. At that instant, another senator, Casca, who was positioned behind him, drew a dagger and struck the first blow, a glancing slash against Caesar's neck. Caesar reacted with the instincts of a soldier. He spun around, caught Casca's arm, and stabbed it with his stylus, a sharp metal pen he used for writing. He was fighting back and fighting hard. But then the others closed in, a pack of wolves descending on their prey. Daggers flashed from all sides. The other senators, not in on the plot, sat frozen in terror for a moment, then scrambled for the exits in a blind panic. Caesar defended himself fiercely, trying to fend off the blows. But then, through the sea of furious faces, he saw him. It was Marcus Junius Brutus, the man he loved like a son, the man he had pardoned and promoted and trusted. As Brutus stepped forward and plunged his own dagger into him, all the will to fight drained from Caesar's body. The ancient historians say that in that moment of ultimate betrayal, he looked into Brutus's eyes and uttered a phrase in Greek that has echoed through the ages. Kai su, teknon? You too, my child. The later Latin version, et tu, Brute, would become immortal. He stopped resisting. He pulled the top of his toga over his head, unwilling to let his assassins see his face in the final moments of his agony. He staggered a few steps, and then collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, which was soon spattered with his blood. He had received 23 stab wounds, though the physicians would later determine that only one, the second blow to his chest, had been fatal. For a moment, there was a dead silence in the great hall, broken only by the sound of Caesar's body falling to the marble floor. The deed was done. Brutus raised his bloody dagger and tried to address the few remaining senators, to explain that they had freed Rome from a tyrant. But no one was listening. The conspirators had killed a man, but they had not killed his legacy. In their desperate attempt to save the Republic, they had just created a martyr, and in doing so had unleashed a new and even more terrible civil war that would destroy the Republic forever. The conspirators, whom history would call the liberators, made a fatal miscalculation. They believed that by killing the man, they had killed the idea of one-man rule. They thought the Roman people, freed from their tyrant, would rise up and thank them for restoring the Republic. They were profoundly wrong. When Brutus addressed the crowd in the Forum, his idealistic speech about liberty was met with a confused and hostile silence. The people had not feared Caesar. They had loved him. He was their champion, the man who gave them jobs, grain, and glorious victories. His death did not feel like liberation. It felt like a betrayal. A power vacuum opened in the heart of Rome. Into this void stepped Caesar's right-hand man and co-consul, Mark Antony. Antony was a brilliant and charismatic general, but also a masterful politician. At Caesar's public funeral, he delivered one of the most effective speeches in history. He began by seeming to praise the assassins, but then he read Caesar's will. The crowd learned that Caesar had left a sum of money to every single citizen of Rome and had bequeathed his magnificent private gardens to the people as a public park. Antony then held up Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointing to the rips and tears made by the daggers. He painted a vivid picture of the brutal murder, transforming the crowd's grief into a burning, uncontrollable rage. A riot erupted. The mob, carrying torches, surged through the city, hunting for the assassins. Brutus, Cassius, and the other liberators were forced to flee for their lives. The Republic had not been saved. It had simply been plunged into a new and more chaotic phase of its long death agony. Far away from this chaos, across the Adriatic Sea in the city of Apollonia in Greece, an 18-year-old student received the news. His name was Gaius Octavius. He was Caesar's grandnephew, the grandson of Caesar's sister, Julia. He was a young man of no great distinction. Physically, he was not imposing. He was often sickly and suffered from poor health his entire life. But behind his frail exterior was a mind of extraordinary intelligence, discipline, and cunning. He was in Apollonia to complete his education and to join Caesar for his upcoming war against the Parthian Empire. The news of his great-uncle's assassination was a devastating shock. But it was followed by a second piece of news, delivered by messengers from Rome, that would change the course of his life and the history of the world. Caesar's will had been read. In it, the dictator had posthumously adopted Gaius Octavius as his son. This meant his name was no longer Gaius Octavius. He was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. We will call him Octavian. But the name was not all he inherited. Caesar had also made him the principal heir to his vast personal fortune. It was a staggering inheritance, but it was also a poison chalice. By accepting it, Octavian would be thrust into the center of Roman politics, a world of ruthless generals and seasoned politicians who would see him as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The name Caesar was no longer a title. It was a target. His family was terrified. His mother, Asia, and his stepfather pleaded with him to be sensible. They urged him to renounce the adoption, to refuse the inheritance, and to remain a private citizen. To claim the legacy of Caesar, they argued, was to invite certain death. He was just a boy. How could he possibly hope to survive in a world now dominated by powerful men like Mark Antony? It was the first great test of Octavian's character, and his response was telling. There was no youthful passion, no rash anger. Instead, he displayed a maturity and a cold, calculating resolve that was utterly chilling in one so young. He listened to all the sensible advice, weighed the enormous risks, and then calmly chose the most dangerous path possible. He understood something his family did not. The inheritance was not just money, it was a name. And that name was the single most powerful political weapon in Rome. He would accept the adoption. He would claim his inheritance. And he would hunt down and destroy the men who had murdered his father. Ignoring the pleas of his family, Octavian gathered his closest friends, including the brilliant military strategist Marcus Agrippa, and set sail for Italy. He was a young man with no army, no political experience, and a fragile constitution. He was stepping into a viper's pit, a world where his name alone made him the enemy of both the liberators who had killed Caesar and the Caesarians like Antony who wished to be his successor. Almost no one in Rome took him seriously. They saw a boy playing at being a man. They did not see the heir. They did not see the cold, methodical ambition in his eyes. They saw the boy Octavius, and they completely underestimated the man who now called himself Caesar. When Octavian landed in Italy, Mark Antony, the seasoned general and consul of Rome, barely gave him a second thought. He refused to hand over Caesar's fortune, treating the young man with open contempt. It was a serious miscalculation. Octavian, using the powerful name of Caesar, skillfully raised his own private army from among the dictator's loyal veterans, who flocked to the banner of their great commander's adopted son. Suddenly, the boy was a player, a new power center in the chaotic world of Roman politics. After a brief and bloody conflict between them, Octavian and Antony realized that fighting each other would only benefit their true enemies, the liberators, who were gathering a massive army in the east. They agreed to a temporary and deeply cynical truce. They met with another of Caesar's former generals, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and formed a new three-man dictatorship called the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the first secret pact between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this triumvirate was a formal, legal institution with absolute power. and their first act showed their true nature. To fund their coming war and eliminate their enemies in Rome, they revived Sulla's terrifying weapon, the proscriptions. Where Caesar had offered clemency, his heirs offered a bloodbath. Lists were once again posted in the Forum. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy citizens were outlawed and murdered, their property confiscated by the triumvirs. It was a brutal purge, and Octavian, the young boy, showed a ruthlessness that would have made Sulla proud. With their power in Rome secured, Antony and Octavian took their legions to Greece. At the Battle of Philippi, they crushed the armies of Brutus and Cassius. Seeing that all was lost, the last champions of the Republic took their own lives. The dream of a free republic, the ideal for which Brutus had sacrificed his honor and his friend, died with them on that battlefield. With their common enemy defeated, the triumvirs divided the Roman world between them. Lepidus was sidelined with the province of Africa. Octavian was given the difficult and thankless task of returning to Italy to settle hundreds of thousands of angry, demobilized veterans on confiscated land. It was a job guaranteed to make him unpopular. Mark Antony, the senior partner, chose for himself the most glamorous and wealthy prize, the East. He would govern the rich provinces of Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and he would be responsible for planning Caesar's delayed war against the Parthian Empire. Antony was in his element. He was a superb soldier and a man of immense appetites, who enjoyed the lavish lifestyle of the Hellenistic kings he now ruled over. As he toured his new domain, he set up his headquarters in the city of Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey. From there, he began the task of reorganizing the provinces and, more importantly, raising the vast sums of money needed to pay his legions. One of the local rulers he summoned to Tarsus to answer for their conduct during the civil war was the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was in a dangerous position. She had given some nominal support to the liberators, and Antony, the new master of the East, could easily depose her and replace her with a more compliant ruler. She was a queen summoned to explain herself to a Roman general. But Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. She was brilliant, multilingual, and a master of political theater. She understood power and she understood powerful men. She decided that she would not arrive in Tarsus as a fearful subordinate, but as a goddess coming to meet a god. She ignored Antony's repeated summons, deliberately making him wait, building the anticipation. And when she finally did arrive, it was a spectacle that would be remembered for all time. She sailed up the river Cydnus not in a warship, but in a magnificent river barge. The barge had a gilded stern, purple sails, and its oars were made of silver, moving in time to the music of flutes and lyres. Cleopatra herself lay on a couch under a golden canopy, dressed in the robes of the goddess Venus. Her attendants were dressed as nymphs and cupids, fanning her and burning sweet-smelling incense that drifted over the riverbanks. The entire city of Tarsus emptied out to witness this incredible sight. Antony himself, sitting on his public tribunal waiting to judge her, was left completely alone. The people whispered that Venus had come to feast with Bacchus, the god with whom Antony often identified himself. She had transformed a political summons into a mythological event, and she was its star. Antony, utterly captivated, invited her to a dinner. She declined, and instead invited him to a feast aboard her barge. The banquet she hosted was so lavish, so opulent, that it left the Roman general and his officers speechless. Antony, a man who appreciated the finer things in life, had never seen anything like it. He was smitten not just by her beauty, but by her intelligence, her wit, and her sheer audacity. What began in Tarsus was far more than a simple romance. It was the fusion of two ambitions into a powerful political and military alliance. Antony, for all his power, desperately needed money to fund his Parthian campaign and to pay his enormous army. Cleopatra controlled the single greatest treasury in the Mediterranean world, the ancient wealth of the pharaohs. and Cleopatra, for her part, needed Antony's military might. His legions were the ultimate guarantee of her throne and the independence of her kingdom. What they found in each other was not just passion, but a shared vision of a new kind of power in the East. While Antony dallied in Egypt, spending the winter with Cleopatra in a haze of luxury and pleasure, back in Rome, his young, underestimated rival was methodically settling veterans, building loyalties, and consolidating his power, patiently waiting for the moment to use Antony's spectacular love affair against him. While Antony was living as the de facto king of the East, ruling from the decadent court of Alexandria, Octavian was in Rome, playing a very different game. He cultivated an image of himself as a traditional Roman, a man of simple tastes, devoted to the ancient gods and the restoration of the Republic. It was a carefully constructed facade, and it stood in stark contrast to the stories that began to trickle back from Egypt. Octavian, a master of information warfare, launched one of the most brilliant and ruthless propaganda campaigns in history. Day after day, his agents spread stories painting Antony not as a Roman general, but as a man who had gone native, a deserter who had abandoned his heritage. He was portrayed as a drunkard, a slave to his passions, utterly bewitched by the foreign queen Cleopatra. Octavian's narrative was simple and powerful. This was not a political dispute between two Romans. This was a struggle for the very soul of Rome against a corrupting Eastern influence. A key part of this strategy involved Octavian's own sister Octavia. She was Antony's legal Roman wife, a woman universally admired for her dignity and virtue. Antony had left her and their children behind in Rome to live with his Egyptian mistress. Octavian ensured that all of Rome saw Octavia's quiet suffering, presenting her as the embodiment of Roman womanhood, betrayed and abandoned in favor of a foreign temptress. The final pieces of Octavian's campaign fell perfectly into place. In a lavish public ceremony in Alexandria, known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones. He declared her the Queen of Kings, and her son by Julius Caesar, Caesarion, the King of Kings. He then proceeded to grant their own children vast territories in the East, lands that were, by right, provinces of the Roman Republic. When news of this reached Rome, it caused an outrage. It seemed to confirm every rumor Octavian had spread. Antony was giving away parts of the empire to his illegitimate foreign children. Octavian then made his boldest move. He went to the Temple of Vesta, where the Vestal Virgins guarded the last wills and testaments of prominent Romans. By force, and in a shocking act of sacrilege, he illegally seized Antony's will. He then read it aloud to the Senate. Its contents were political dynamite. Antony not only confirmed the Donations of Alexandria, but he also formally recognized Caesarion as Caesar's true son, a direct challenge to Octavian's own legitimacy. And worst of all, he requested that upon his death, his body should be sent back to Alexandria to be buried beside Cleopatra. To the Roman people, this was the ultimate betrayal. A Roman general wished to be buried in a foreign land next to a foreign queen. Octavian had won the propaganda war. The Senate, filled with indignation, stripped Antony of his command and his future consulship. But Octavian was too clever to have them declare war on Antony. Romans hated civil wars. So, with great ceremony, he declared war not on a fellow Roman, but on the foreign queen Cleopatra. He framed the entire conflict as a righteous war to defend Rome from an ambitious Egyptian monarch and her bewitched general. All of Italy swore an oath of personal loyalty, not to the state, but to Octavian himself. The final confrontation took place in the autumn of 31 BC, off the western coast of Greece, near a promontory called Actium. Antony and Cleopatra had gathered a massive fleet of some 500 ships. Many were huge, multi-decked galleys, floating fortresses bristling with catapults and towers. They were powerful, but slow and difficult to maneuver. Blocking them in the bay was Octavian's fleet, commanded by his lifelong friend and military genius, Marcus Agrippa. Agrippa had fewer ships, perhaps 400, and they were smaller, lighter, and more agile vessels known as Liburnians. It was a contest of brute strength versus speed and skill. On the day of the battle, Antony's fleet rode out to meet Agrippa's. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Agrippa's smaller ships swarmed around Antony's lumbering giants, acting like wolf packs. They avoided direct ramming, instead aiming to smash the oars, rendering the huge ships helpless, and using archers and catapults to set their decks on fire. The battle raged for hours with no clear winner. Then, sometime in the afternoon, the decisive and inexplicable moment occurred. A squadron of 60 Egyptian ships, with Cleopatra herself on the flagship, suddenly hoisted their sails, a strange move in the middle of a battle, and made a dash through a gap in the fighting. They were not attacking, they were fleeing. They were escaping, carrying the Egyptian state treasury with them. Antony, on his own flagship in the heat of the battle, saw her fleet sailing away. And in that moment, he made a decision that would seal his fate and end his career. Instead of continuing to lead his men, instead of fighting for the empire he controlled, he abandoned the battle. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship and chased after Cleopatra, leaving his entire fleet and his massive land army, which was watching from the shore, without a commander. For the men who had followed him for years, who had trusted him completely, it was the ultimate act of betrayal. Their morale collapsed. The fleet, left leaderless, fought on bravely for a time, but with no hope of victory, they began to surrender to Agrippa one by one. His land army held out for a week, refusing to believe their general had deserted them. Finally, they too surrendered and swore allegiance to Octavian. The Battle of Actium was over. It had been less a great military victory than a complete moral collapse on the part of Antony. By abandoning his men for a woman, he had lost everything: his army, his honor, and his claim to the Roman world. Octavian was now the sole, undisputed master of the empire. The last of the civil wars was over. The Republic was dead. And the age of the emperors was about to begin. The year after Actium, Octavian's legions landed in Egypt. The end for Antony and Cleopatra was now a certainty. Antony's remaining forces deserted him, flocking to Octavian's banner. Hearing a false rumor that Cleopatra was dead, Antony fell on his own sword. The suicide was botched, and the dying general was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself. He died in her arms. Cleopatra was captured and brought before Octavian. The cold, calculating young man and the brilliant, charismatic queen met face to face. She tried to use her legendary charm on him, but his will was like ice. He was immune. He intended to take her back to Rome and parade her through the streets in his triumph, the ultimate symbol of his victory. But Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, a descendant of Alexander the Great's own general, would not suffer such a humiliation. She famously took her own life, according to legend, by the bite of an asp smuggled to her in a basket of figs. With her death, the Hellenistic age, the world created by Alexander's conquests 3 centuries earlier, came to a final dramatic end. Octavian was now 33 years old, and he was the sole undisputed master of the Roman world. He had avenged his father. He had defeated all his rivals. And most importantly, he had brought an end to nearly a century of devastating civil wars. A generation of Romans had grown up knowing nothing but bloodshed and chaos. Now, for the first time in their lives, there was peace. When he returned to Rome, he was met not with fear, but with overwhelming relief and adoration. He was hailed as the savior of the state. He held a magnificent triumph, celebrating his victories and displaying the immense wealth of Egypt, which he now controlled as his personal property. The treasury was flooded, soldiers were paid, and the people were given generous donations. But now Octavian faced his greatest challenge, a problem far more complex than any battle. What was he to do with the absolute power he now held? He had seen what happened to his adoptive father when he was named dictator for life. To declare himself a king or a dictator would be suicide. The Roman aristocracy would never accept it. But to simply give up power and restore the old, broken republic would be to invite a new round of civil wars among ambitious nobles. What he did next was a masterstroke of political genius, a piece of theater so subtle and effective that it would define the next 200 years of Roman history. After consolidating his power for a few years, he went before the Senate and made a stunning announcement. He declared that the emergency was over and that the republic had been restored. He formally relinquished all his extraordinary powers, returning control of the armies and the provinces to the Senate and the people of Rome. He presented himself as just another citizen, a servant of the state. The senators were thrown into a state of choreographed panic. They knew that without him, the fragile peace would shatter. They also knew that this was what he expected of them. So they played their part in his script. They protested. They begged him not to abandon the state he had saved. They insisted that he must remain in command. After a show of modest reluctance, Octavian graciously accepted. He agreed to take responsibility for the most troublesome provinces: Spain, Gaul, and Syria, the very provinces where the vast majority of Rome's legions were stationed. This gave him control of the army, while leaving the peaceful, demilitarized provinces under the Senate's authority. It was a brilliant move that maintained the illusion of shared power. Then, the Senate offered him a new name, a new title, to honor his unique position. They wanted to call him Romulus after the founder of the city, but that name had the undertones of a king. Instead, they settled on a word that was both grander and more ambiguous: Augustus. The name had religious connotations. It meant the revered one, the illustrious one. It elevated him above all other mortals, giving him a semi-divine aura, without officially making him a monarch. And so, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus became Imperator Caesar Augustus. He never took the title of king or dictator. He called himself Princeps Civitatis, the first citizen of the state. He lived in a modest house, wore the simple toga of a senator, and always treated his fellow senators with respect. The old machinery of the republic continued to function. Consuls were elected. The Senate debated and passed laws. The illusion of the republic was perfectly maintained. But it was only an illusion. Behind the scenes, Augustus held all the real power. His control of the key armies gave him the ultimate authority. His personal wealth, greater than that of the state itself, allowed him to act as a patron to the entire empire. He had created a new system, the Principate, a monarchy cleverly disguised as a republic. He had learned the final lesson from his father's death. Romans would give a man absolute power as long as they were never forced to call him a king. He would rule for over 40 years, ushering in an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The Republic was dead, and the Roman Empire had been born. The new system created by Augustus proved to be remarkably stable. For the next 2 centuries, the Roman world would experience a period of unprecedented tranquility and prosperity, an era that would become known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The age of civil war was a distant memory. The legions were stationed far away on the frontiers, guarding the empire from external threats. Within its vast borders, trade flourished, cities grew, and Roman civilization reached its zenith. Nowhere was this golden age more apparent than on the sun-drenched shores of the Bay of Naples, in the region of Campania. This was the playground of the Roman elite, a place of breathtaking beauty and immense wealth. The volcanic soil was incredibly fertile, producing the finest wine and olive oil in the empire. The sea was a brilliant, shimmering blue, dotted with the luxurious villas of senators, merchants, and the emperors themselves, who came here to escape the summer heat and the noise of the capital. At the heart of this idyllic landscape stood a collection of prosperous towns. The largest and most vibrant was Pompeii. It was not a quiet resort, but a bustling commercial hub with a population of around 20,000 people. Its stone-paved streets were alive with the sounds of commerce and daily life. The air was filled with the scent of fresh bread from its many bakeries, the clamor of metalworkers in their shops, and the loud chatter spilling out from its numerous taverns and bars. The walls of its buildings were covered in graffiti, political slogans, lovers' messages, and crude jokes, the authentic and censored voice of the Roman people. Life in Pompeii was loud, busy, and full of energy. Nearby, nestled closer to the sea, was the smaller, more elegant town of Herculaneum. It was a more exclusive community, a seaside resort favored by the truly wealthy. Its villas were even more magnificent, its atmosphere more refined. Life here moved at a slower, more leisurely pace. The people of these towns lived their lives under the watchful gaze of a great mountain that dominated the entire landscape. They called it Vesuvius, but to them it was not a threat. It was a gentle giant, a symbol of the region's prosperity. Its slopes were covered in lush green vineyards and shady groves, a beautiful backdrop to their daily lives. The Romans of Campania had no memory of it ever being anything other than a peaceful, fertile mountain. The very word volcano did not exist in their language. They lived on the side of a sleeping monster, and they did not even know its name. There had been warnings, of course. 17 years earlier, in 62 AD, a devastating earthquake had rocked the entire region. Much of Pompeii and Herculaneum had been reduced to rubble. But the Romans were a practical and resilient people. They did not connect the shaking of the earth with the great mountain that loomed over them. Earthquakes were a known, if unpleasant, fact of life in that part of the world. They saw the event not as a harbinger of something worse, but simply as a natural disaster to be overcome. And so they rebuilt. They rolled up their sleeves and began the slow, arduous process of repairing their homes, their temples, and their public buildings, often making them even grander than before. In the years that followed, smaller tremors became a common occurrence. The people of Campania grew accustomed to the occasional shaking of the ground. They learned to live with it. It became part of the normal rhythm of their lives, a minor inconvenience in their otherwise perfect world. And so, on a hot summer morning in the year 79 AD, the day began like any other. In Pompeii, bakers were pulling the first loaves of bread from their ovens. In the grand villas of Herculaneum, wealthy Romans were enjoying a late breakfast. In the Forum, merchants were haggling over the price of goods, and politicians were making their final pitches before the upcoming elections. Children were playing in the streets. Slaves were going about their daily chores. It was a day of absolute mundane normalcy, bathed in the warm Campanian sun. No one looked up at the peaceful green mountain with anything other than familiarity. No one suspected that in just a few hours, time itself would stop, and their vibrant, living world would be erased from the face of the earth. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the illusion of normalcy was shattered. A tremendous explosion, a sound louder than any thunder, erupted from the heart of the mountain, shaking the earth for miles around. The summit of Vesuvius blew apart. From this new crater, a colossal column of gas, ash, and pulverized rock was blasted into the sky, climbing miles high into the stratosphere. Across the Bay of Naples, at the naval base of Misenum, a man was observing this terrifying spectacle. His name was Gaius Plinius Secundus, known to history as Pliny the Elder. Pliny was one of the most remarkable minds of his age. He was a man of boundless, almost obsessive curiosity, driven by a relentless desire to understand every aspect of the natural world. His life's work was the Naturalis Historia, the natural history, a monumental encyclopedia attempting to catalog all known knowledge. But he was not just a scholar. He was also a man of action and duty, a high-ranking official in the Roman government and, at that moment, the commander of the entire Roman fleet stationed at Misenum. When the strange cloud appeared, Pliny's first reaction was that of a scientist. He had never seen anything like it. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, who was with him that day and whose letters would preserve this story for all time, described the cloud as resembling a giant Mediterranean pine tree. It had a long, tall trunk that rose high into the sky before spreading out into a vast branching canopy. The scholar in Pliny was captivated. He saw a unique natural phenomenon, and his immediate instinct was to study it more closely. He ordered a light, fast ship to be prepared. He was going to sail across the bay to get a better look. As he was about to leave, a messenger arrived, breathless and covered in dust. He carried an urgent note from a friend of Pliny's, a woman named Rectina. Her villa was situated at the very foot of Vesuvius, and she was trapped. With the land routes cut off by the eruption, her only hope of escape was by sea. In that instant, Pliny's mission changed completely. The scholar's curiosity was instantly replaced by the commander's sense of duty. This was no longer a scientific expedition. It was a rescue mission. He canceled the lightship and ordered his massive warships, the quadriremes, to be launched. His goal was now to save not just his friend, but as many people as he could from the terrified communities along the coast. As he boarded his flagship, he was heard to remark, "Fortis fortuna juvat." Fortune favors the brave. He was sailing directly into the jaws of the apocalypse. As his fleet rode across the bay, the scene grew more and more horrific. The sky grew dark as a thick cloud of ash began to blot out the sun. It soon began to rain, but not water. Hot pumice stones and black rocks hailed down from the sky, clattering on the decks of the ships. The sea itself became shallow and choked with volcanic debris, making navigation nearly impossible. The helmsman of Pliny's ship, terrified, urged his commander to turn back. Pliny's response was a testament to his character. "No," he commanded. "Fortune favors the brave. Steer for Pomponianus." He was heading for the town of Stabii, further down the coast, where another friend was trapped. He landed and found his friend Pomponianus in a state of panic, trying to load his possessions onto a ship, but the winds had turned, trapping him on the shore. To calm the terrified man, Pliny projected an aura of absolute stoic calm. He embraced his friend, and then, as if it were a perfectly normal day, he ordered the servants to draw him a bath. After bathing, he joined his friends for dinner, eating and conversing with a cheerful demeanor, assuring them that the fires on the mountainside were just abandoned farmhouses burning. Later that night, as the villa began to fill with ash and the ground shook with violent tremors, Pliny's companions were in a state of terror. But the great commander, to show his lack of concern, simply went to his room and fell into a deep sleep. His snoring was reportedly so loud that his attendants could hear it from the hallway. Eventually, the situation became untenable. His servants woke him, and they decided they had to flee the villa. To protect themselves from the ceaseless rain of falling rocks, they tied pillows to their heads with linen strips. They made their way down to the beach, but the sea was still far too violent and chaotic to allow any escape by ship. The air was growing thick with the smell of sulfur and poisonous volcanic gases. Pliny, who was a heavy-set man and suffered from a chronic respiratory ailment, likely asthma, began to struggle for breath. He asked for cold water, which he drank twice. Then, leaning on two of his slaves for support, he tried to stand, but immediately collapsed. He was overcome by the toxic fumes. He did not cry out or struggle. He simply lay down and died, as his nephew would later write, looking more like a man asleep than one who was dead. When the eruption finally subsided 3 days later, his body was found on the shore. It was completely unharmed, with no visible injuries, his clothes intact. He had died not in a panic, but in the quiet fulfillment of his duty. He was a man who had dedicated his life to understanding nature, and in the end, He gave his life in a heroic, if futile, attempt to save others from its most terrifying and destructive force. 300 years have passed since the fires of Vesuvius consumed Pompeii. The Roman Empire, the world that Pliny the Elder knew, has profoundly changed. The golden age of the Pax Romana is a fading memory. The empire is an aging giant, stretched to its limits. It is now so vast and unwieldy that it is administered as two separate halves. A Western empire ruled from Italy, and a wealthier, more stable Eastern empire ruled from the magnificent new capital of Constantinople. The legions that guard its long frontiers are no longer filled with Italian farm boys. Now they are largely composed of barbarians, men from the very tribes the empire once fought, who now serve Rome for pay and the promise of citizenship. Our story now moves to the northern frontier, to the great Danube River. For centuries, this mighty river was more than a geographical feature. It was the symbolic boundary between order and chaos, between the Roman world of cities, laws, and roads, and the vast, untamed wilderness of what the Romans called Barbaricum. It was a line that had been held for generations. But in the late 4th century, a storm was gathering in the distant east that would shatter this ancient barrier forever. From the vast wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, a new and terrifying force had emerged: the Huns. They were a nomadic people, warriors of unparalleled ferocity and skill. Fighting on horseback, they seemed to live in the saddle, moving like a human tidal wave across the landscape. They were utterly ruthless, and the sheer terror they inspired preceded them like a plague. As they pushed westward, they shattered the established tribal alliances, conquering, enslaving, or displacing every people they encountered. Caught directly in the path of this human hurricane was a large Germanic people known as the Goths. The Goths had lived along the borders of the Roman Empire for a long time. They were a familiar presence, sometimes enemies, sometimes trading partners, sometimes even Roman allies. But they were no match for the Huns. Their armies were broken, their lands were ravaged, and their people were faced with a terrible choice: stay and face certain annihilation at the hands of the Huns, or flee and place their fate in the hands of the Romans. In the autumn of the year 376, a vast multitude of Goths arrived on the northern bank of the Danube. This was not an invading army. It was an entire nation on the move, tens of thousands of warriors, but also their wives, their children, and their elderly, with all their worldly possessions loaded onto a massive train of wagons. They were led by a chieftain named Fritigern. They were not conquerors. They were refugees, a people terrified and broken, looking for a safe haven. From their camp, Fritigern sent envoys across the river with a desperate plea addressed to the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens. They begged the emperor to show them mercy. They asked for permission to cross the Danube and to be settled on the sparsely populated lands of the Roman province of Thrace. In return, they promised everything a Roman emperor could desire. They swore they would live as peaceful, loyal subjects. They would farm the land, pay taxes, and most importantly, they would provide a limitless supply of their finest warriors to serve as recruits in the Roman army. The Emperor Valens was far away in Antioch, in Syria, preparing for a major war against the Persian Empire. When the Goths' proposal reached him, he did not see a threat. He saw a golden opportunity. An entire nation of hardy, proven fighters was volunteering to join the empire and serve in its armies. This was a massive, self-replenishing source of military manpower, delivered directly to his doorstep for free. It seemed like a stroke of immense good fortune, a gift from the gods. It would save him the trouble and expense of recruiting troops for his Persian war from his own provinces. After some deliberation, Valens made his fateful decision. He accepted their offer. The Goths would be allowed to cross the river and become subjects of the Roman Empire. But he imposed strict conditions. First, all Gothic warriors were to surrender their weapons upon crossing to Roman officials. Second, Their children were to be separated from their families and sent to be raised and educated in cities deeper within the empire. This was partly to ensure their good behavior, the children would be hostages, and partly to Romanize the next generation. The terms were harsh and humiliating. To a warrior people like the Goths, giving up their weapons was the ultimate symbol of submission. To give up their children was a heartbreaking sacrifice. But on the far side of the river, they could hear the rumors of the approaching Huns. Their desperation was absolute. Fritigern and the Gothic leaders agreed to the emperor's terms. They saw no other choice. It was a decision made in the hope of survival, a hope that would soon be betrayed by the cruelty and greed of the very Roman officials sent to oversee their salvation. What began as a calculated policy of resettlement quickly descended into a humanitarian nightmare, not because of a flaw in the emperor's strategy, but because of the boundless greed of the men assigned to implement it. The command of the Danube frontier was held by two Roman officials, a general named Lipicinus and a bureaucrat named Maximus. These two men saw the Gothic migration not as a state-building opportunity, but as a chance for personal enrichment. The crossing of the Danube was chaotic. The Romans were overwhelmed by the sheer number of people, and the process was horrifically mismanaged. But it was the disarmament policy that collapsed first. The Roman soldiers, seeing the desperation of the Goths, began demanding bribes. For a price, a Gothic warrior could keep his sword or his spear. The most corrupt officials secured wealth and slaves, while the Goths, who were meant to be rendered harmless, entered the empire armed and angry. Once on the Roman side of the river, the Goths were herded into temporary holding camps. They were exhausted, disoriented, and completely dependent on the Romans for food, which Emperor Valens had ordered to be provided. But Lipicinus and Maximus saw another opportunity for profit. They hoarded the state-supplied grain and began selling it back to the starving refugees at monstrously inflated prices. A single loaf of bread could cost a Goth his savings. The situation grew so dire that the Romans engaged in an even more ghoulish trade. They began selling the Goths the meat of dogs, scavenged from the city dumps, and for the price of one dog carcass, they demanded a Gothic child to be sold into slavery. Parents, faced with the impossible choice of watching their entire family starve or giving up one child for a scrap of food, were forced into heartbreaking bargains. The Goths, who had come to Rome seeking mercy and protection, were being treated with a cruelty worse than anything they had feared from the Huns. Their hope turned to a slow-burning, silent rage. They were subjects of the empire, but they were being treated worse than cattle. Fritigern, their leader, did his best to maintain peace, desperately trying to negotiate with the Roman authorities for the promised supplies. The culmination of this policy of exploitation came at the city of Martianople. Lipicinus, with a show of false friendship, invited Fritigern and the other senior Gothic chieftains to a lavish banquet inside the city walls. While the leaders were being entertained, their main body of warriors was ordered to remain camped outside. As the wine flowed and Lipicinus offered toasts to a new era of cooperation, his Roman soldiers surrounded the Goths' personal bodyguards, who were waiting outside the palace. The plan was likely to murder the bodyguards and then seize Fritigern and the other leaders, decapitating the Gothic leadership in one swift, treacherous stroke. But the attack was clumsy. The Goths fought back fiercely. Inside the banquet hall, Fritigern heard the sounds of battle from the courtyard. He instantly understood the situation. It was a trap. With cold fury, he drew his own concealed sword. He and the other chieftains overturned the tables, fought their way out of the palace, and escaped the city to rejoin their people. The patience of the Goths had finally snapped. This was not just corruption. It was a profound betrayal. Fritigern rode into his camp, no longer a diplomat, but a war chief. He told his people what had happened, and the simmering anger of tens of thousands of starved, humiliated, and well-armed warriors exploded into open rebellion. The refugees were now an invading army. They burst out of their camps and began to burn and plunder the rich, undefended province of Thrace, taking a bloody revenge for every cruelty and every indignity they had suffered. The fire that Lupicinus had so carelessly lit was now an uncontrollable inferno. When news of the full-scale rebellion reached Emperor Valens in Antioch, he was furious. He hastily concluded his peace with the Persians and began marching his formidable eastern field army west, determined to crush the ungrateful barbarians himself. Valens was a man of average ability and deep insecurities. He was a devout Christian, but also prone to fits of rage, and he was deeply suspicious of those around him. Most of all, he craved a major military victory that would solidify his own legacy. He had always lived in the shadow of his more dynamic and militarily successful nephew, Gratian, the Emperor of the West. As Valens prepared his campaign, he received messages from Gratian. The Western Emperor had just won a major victory over Germanic tribes on the Rhine and was now marching east with his veteran legions to help his uncle. He urged Valens to be cautious, to wait for his arrival so their combined armies could annihilate the Goths without any risk. This was sound military advice. But for a man like Valens, it was also an insult to his pride. His own courtiers and flatterers, sensing his insecurity, began to whisper in his ear. "Why should you share the glory with that boy Gratian?" they asked. "Your own army is more than a match for these ragged barbarians. Win this victory yourself, and all the honor will belong to you alone." Envy and pride are a fatal combination in a commander. The thought of his nephew arriving to save the day was intolerable to Valens. He made his decision. He would not wait for Gratian. He would march his army to the city of Adrianople, find the Goths and destroy them. He was confident of a swift and easy victory. It was a decision born of arrogance, a fatal underestimation of his enemy, and a deep personal jealousy. He was marching not just towards a battle, but towards a destiny that would change the course of Roman history. On the morning of August 9th, 378 AD, Emperor Valens led his army out from the city of Adrianople. His scouts had reported that the main Gothic camp was just a few miles away. The day was already oppressively hot, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the soldiers. Against the advice of his more experienced generals, Valens gave his men no time for a proper meal or rest. Driven by his eagerness for a quick and glorious victory, he ordered a forced march. For 8 long miles, the heavily armored Roman infantry trudged over the dusty, sun-baked plains of Thrace, growing more exhausted and thirsty with every step. When the Romans finally approached the Gothic position, they saw that the enemy had formed their wagons into a great circle, a defensive fortress known as a Wagenburg. From behind this barricade, the Gothic infantry watched the Romans deploy. Fritigern, the Gothic leader, knew that his greatest advantage, his heavy cavalry, had not yet returned from a wide-ranging foraging mission. He needed to buy time. So, he resorted to cunning. He set fire to the dry grass in the fields between the two armies, sending thick, choking smoke billowing into the faces of the weary Romans, adding to their misery and thirst. Then, he began to play for time with diplomacy. He sent a series of envoys to the emperor's camp, proposing negotiations. Valens, still believing he was in complete control of the situation, wavered. He was drawn into the lengthy process of exchanging messengers and discussing terms. All the while, Fritigern's eyes were scanning the horizon, waiting for the telltale cloud of dust that would signal the return of his cavalry. The Roman soldiers, standing for hours in the blistering heat without water, grew restless and impatient. The battle, when it finally began, did not start with a clear order from the emperor. A few trigger-happy auxiliary units, without waiting for the signal, charged forward on their own initiative. Seeing them attack, the rest of the Roman line had to follow, surging forward in a disorganized and chaotic wave. They crashed against the wagon circle, and a brutal, grinding battle began. The Roman infantry, despite their exhaustion, fought with their customary discipline, slowly beginning to push the Gothic defenders back. For a moment, it seemed that Roman valor might overcome their emperor's poor decisions. And then, at that critical moment, it happened. From over the hills, a vast cloud of dust appeared. Fritigern's waiting game had paid off. The Gothic heavy cavalry had returned. With a thunderous roar that was said to have shaken the very earth, they descended upon the battlefield like an avalanche. They did not slow or halt. They charged at full gallop directly into the Roman army's left flank, where the Roman cavalry was positioned. The impact was devastating. The Roman horsemen, caught completely by surprise and already disorganized, were shattered and swept from the field. But the Gothic cavalry did not stop to pursue them. They wheeled their horses around and crashed into the now completely exposed flank and rear of the Roman infantry. At the same time, the Gothic infantry, emboldened by the arrival of their cavalry, let out a great cheer and launched a ferocious counterattack from behind the wagons. The Roman army, in a horrifying echo of the disaster at Cannae 600 years earlier, was suddenly and completely surrounded. What followed was a massacre. The legionaries, trapped and pressed together in a shrinking pocket, were assailed from all sides. The long spears of the Gothic cavalry struck them down from behind, while the infantry hacked at them from the front. Discipline dissolved into terror. The proud Roman legions, the inheritors of the legacy of Caesar, were reduced to a helpless, terrified mob. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Emperor Valens, dismounted from his horse, was caught in the middle of the slaughter. He fought on foot among the ranks of his elite palace guards, who formed a desperate protective circle around him. But soon, they too were overwhelmed and cut down. What happened to the emperor in the final moments is not known for certain. One account says he was struck in the face by an arrow and died anonymously among the heaps of his fallen soldiers. A second, more tragic story was told by the few who survived. It holds that the emperor, severely wounded, was carried from the field by his bodyguards to a nearby peasant's farmhouse. The Goths, unaware that the emperor was inside, surrounded the farmhouse, and when its occupants resisted, they set it on fire. The emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, the man whose pride had led his army to ruin, was burned alive in an unmarked cottage, his body never to be found. By nightfall, the killing was over. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army, the professional core of its military might, lay dead on the field of Adrianople. The emperor was gone, and with him, 35 of his highest-ranking tribunes and generals. It was more than just a defeat. It was an annihilation. It shattered the myth of the invincibility of Roman infantry, and it left the Balkan provinces completely defenseless, the gateway into the heart of the empire now thrown wide open. The wound inflicted at Adrianople was a mortal one, a blow from which the Western Roman Empire would never truly recover. The disaster at Adrianople did not immediately destroy the Roman Empire, but it forced it to accept a new and dangerous reality. The legions could no longer keep the barbarians out. The new emperor in the east, Theodosius, a brilliant diplomat and general, understood this. Instead of trying to expel the Goths, he made a treaty with them. He allowed them to settle permanently inside Roman territory, not as conquered subjects, but as autonomous allies or foederati. They would live under their own laws and be led by their own chieftains, and in return, they would fight for the empire. This policy created a dangerous precedent. The empire now had independent, armed barbarian nations living within its borders. It was a temporary solution that would, in time, dissolve the very fabric of the Western Empire. Our story now moves into this new, fragile world and focuses on a man who was a product of it. His name was Alaric, the king of the Visigoths. History often paints Alaric as a savage barbarian, a destroyer of worlds who brought the eternal city to its knees. But the truth is far more complex and far more tragic. Alaric was not some wild chieftain from the dark forests of Germany. He was a man who had spent his entire life in and around the Roman world. He was a Christian. He likely spoke fluent Latin. And most importantly, he was a Roman soldier. He and his Gothic warriors had served the empire faithfully as foederati. He had fought in the brutal civil wars under Emperor Theodosius himself, rising to a position of command. He had seen the power and the glory of Rome up close. He did not want to destroy it. He admired it. What Alaric wanted, with a burning, desperate ambition, was to become a part of it. He wanted what any great Roman general would want: a secure, permanent homeland for his people, the Visigoths, and for himself, a legitimate, high-ranking command in the Roman military structure, a title like Magister Militum, or Master of the Soldiers. He wanted to serve Rome, but as a recognized partner, not as a disposable mercenary. But the Roman world he had to deal with was a shadow of its former self, particularly in the West. The Western Roman emperor was a weak and ineffectual young man named Honorius. Terrified of the constant threat of invasion, he had abandoned Rome and moved his court to the city of Ravenna in northern Italy. Ravenna was a perfect fortress, surrounded by impassable swamps and marshes. From this safe, isolated capital, the emperor lived a life of pampered luxury, detached from the realities of his crumbling empire. His court was a nest of vipers, a place of constant intrigue, paranoia, and deep-seated anti-barbarian prejudice. The traditional Roman aristocracy despised men like Alaric, viewing them as uncivilized savages, regardless of their service to the empire. In this decadent and fearful court, there was one man of supreme ability, a general named Stilicho. Stilicho was the commander-in-chief of all the Western Roman armies and, as the guardian of the young emperor, the de facto ruler of the empire. He was a military genius, a brilliant commander who had, on several occasions, defeated Alaric in battle. But Stilicho was also a pragmatist. He himself was of Vandal descent, a barbarian who had risen to the highest position in the state. He understood men like Alaric. He knew that Alaric's Goths were a force that could not simply be wished away. He believed that the best way to handle them was through diplomacy and negotiation, to integrate them into the Roman system and use their strength to defend the empire. For years, he skillfully managed the threat, playing a complex game of politics and warfare, keeping Alaric at bay while trying to satisfy his demands. But Stilicho's barbarian heritage made him a target for the xenophobic faction at court. A powerful court official named Olympus whispered poison into the ear of the weak-willed Emperor Honorius. He convinced the emperor that Stilicho was a traitor, that his negotiations with Alaric were part of a secret plot to overthrow the emperor and place his own son on the throne. In the year 408, the plot came to fruition. Honorius, convinced of his guardian's treachery, ordered his arrest and execution. Stilicho, the one man with the talent and the vision to save the Western Empire, was beheaded. His death unleashed a wave of horrific anti-barbarian violence across Italy. The families of the barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army, men who had sworn an oath of loyalty to the empire, were hunted down and massacred by Roman troops. This was the final, unforgivable betrayal. 30,000 of these professional battle-hardened soldiers, enraged by the murder of their families, deserted the Roman army and flocked to Alaric's camp. They did not just offer him their swords, they begged him for revenge. Alaric, who had tried for years to find a peaceful solution, now found himself at the head of a massive, unified, and furious army. The path of diplomacy was closed. The one Roman he could trust was dead. He had been patient. He had been reasonable. He had been betrayed at every turn. Now there was nothing left to do but to use the only language the Roman court seemed to understand: brute force. And he would direct that force at the most vulnerable and symbolic target in the entire empire: the ancient, undefended city of Rome itself. Alaric now had the perfect weapon: a massive, vengeful army. But even now, his first instinct was not to destroy, but to negotiate. He understood that Rome's ancient walls were too strong to be taken by storm. He also knew that the city's true value was not in its buildings, but in its symbolism. He would not attack Rome. He would hold it hostage. His war was not with the people of Rome, but with the foolish emperor hiding in Ravenna. In late 408, he marched his army into Italy and surrounded the city, cutting off all roads and severing its connection to the port of Ostia, through which all its grain supplies arrived from Africa. This was the first siege of Rome. Inside the walls, a city of nearly 1 million people slowly began to starve. The food rations were cut again and again. The population was reduced to eating whatever they could find. As the weeks turned into months, the situation became horrific. The eternal city was consumed by famine and disease. Finally, the Roman Senate, desperate and abandoned by their emperor, sent an embassy to Alaric's camp to ask for his terms. When the envoys tried to intimidate the Gothic king, boasting that the people of Rome were still numerous and ready to fight, Alaric is said to have laughed and given a grim, famous reply: "The thicker the hay, the easier it is mown." His terms for lifting the siege were brutally high. He demanded all the gold and silver in the city, all valuable goods, and all barbarian slaves. "What then will be left to us?" the desperate envoys asked. Alaric replied coldly, "Your lives." In the end, they negotiated a slightly lesser, but still astronomical price. To pay it, the Romans were forced to strip the gold from their statues and melt down the treasures from their temples. Alaric took his payment and, true to his word, withdrew his army. He still hoped that this demonstration of his power would bring the emperor to the negotiating table. But the court in Ravenna had learned nothing. Emperor Honorius, protected by his swamps, still refused to grant Alaric's reasonable demands for land and a title. A year passed in fruitless negotiations, filled with Roman arrogance and bad faith. Frustrated, Alaric marched on Rome a second time. This time, he seized the port of Ostia and, by threatening to cut off the grain supply completely, forced the Senate to depose Honorius and proclaim a new, more compliant emperor of their own, a man named Priscus Attalus. But this puppet emperor proved to be useless, and Alaric, growing tired of the farce, soon removed him from power. He made one last final attempt to negotiate with Honorius directly. He met with the emperor's commander near Ravenna. But during the negotiations, his camp was treacherously attacked by a rival Gothic chieftain who was in the pay of the Romans. This was the final straw. Alaric had been patient. He had been honorable. He had been treated with contempt, deceit, and now outright treachery. His own authority as a leader was on the line. His people were tired of years of wandering and broken promises. His patience was finally and completely exhausted. The time for talking was over. In the sweltering heat of August, in the year 410, Alaric marched his army towards the walls of Rome for the third and final time. He made no preparations for a long siege. He didn't need to. The city fell not with a crash, but with a quiet act of betrayal. On the night of August 24th, someone on the inside opened the Salarian gate. History does not record who it was. Perhaps it was a disgruntled slave who saw the Goths as liberators. Perhaps it was a starving citizen who believed a quick end was better than a slow agony. In the dead of night, the Visigoths poured into the city that had, for 800 years, been the unconquered heart of the known world. What followed was not the mindless slaughter that Roman propagandists would later describe. Alaric was a Christian, and he gave his men 2 strict orders. First, they were to spare the lives of anyone who sought sanctuary in the great Christian basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul. Second, they were to avoid needless bloodshed. Their primary goal was not murder, but plunder. For 3 days, the Goths systematically sacked the city. They broke into the magnificent palaces of the Roman senators on the Aventine Hill, carrying off centuries of accumulated wealth. Gold, silver plate, expensive furniture, and silken tapestries. It was a methodical and organized plundering, the paying of a debt that Alaric felt he was owed. There was violence, of course. Houses were burned. People were killed. But it was not the total destruction of a city like Carthage. Alaric sought to humiliate Rome, not to erase it. After 3 days, he led his army out of the city, loaded with unimaginable treasures, and marched south. But the physical damage to Rome, while significant, was not the most important consequence. The true impact was psychological. The news that Rome itself had fallen, that the eternal city was not, in fact, eternal, sent a shockwave of disbelief and terror across the entire empire. In a monastery in distant Bethlehem, the great scholar Saint Jerome heard the news and wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The light of the world has been extinguished. The myth that had been stronger than any wall had been shattered." The fall of Rome in 410 was not the end of the Western Roman Empire, but it was the end of the idea of Rome. It was the mortal blow from which the empire's prestige would never recover. The sack of Rome by Alaric was not the final day of the Western Roman Empire. It would linger on for another 66 years, a hollow shell of its former glory. But the fall of the city was the moment the myth died. It was the final tolling bell that announced the coming of a long twilight. And so our journey through 7 decisive days comes to an end. We have traveled a vast distance from a single furrow plowed into the earth on the Palatine Hill to the broken gates of a city that once ruled the world. We have seen that the story of Rome's rise and fall is not a story of inevitable forces or abstract trends. It is the story of people. It is the story of individual character, magnified on the world stage. It begins with the ambition of Romulus, a man raised by wolves, who built a city on a foundation of his own brother's blood, a violent birth that would prophesize the civil wars to come. We saw the genius of Hannibal, a man bound by a childhood oath of hatred, who could outwit any Roman army but could not defeat the sheer, stubborn resolve of the Roman spirit itself, a resolve born in the ashes of Cannae. We witnessed the ambition of Caesar, a man who saw a broken republic and believed only he could fix it. And we felt the inner torment of Brutus, a man of principle who sacrificed his friend to save an ideal, only to discover that in killing the man, he had made the idea of a king inevitable. We watched the cold, patient calculation of the young Octavian, a boy who inherited a name and turned it into an empire, cloaking a monarchy in the traditions of a republic so skillfully that Rome itself barely noticed the transition. We stood beside Pliny the Elder, a man whose courage was not that of a soldier, but of a scholar, who faced the fury of a volcano with a stoic's calm and a commander's sense of duty. We saw how the pride and envy of a single insecure Emperor Valens could lead a magnificent army into annihilation at Adrianople, a single man's character flaw creating a wound from which the empire would bleed for a century. And finally, we walked with Alaric, the barbarian who wanted to be a Roman, a man whose reasonable demands were met with arrogance and deceit until his frustration boiled over and broke the gates of the eternal city. These men, and countless others like them, were the architects of Rome's destiny. Its greatness was their greatness, their courage, their ambition, their genius. And its fatal flaws were their flaws, their pride, their greed, their cruelty, and their inability to change a system that was slowly consuming itself. But now our story is over. Let the images of these men and their deeds begin to fade. The tramp of legions on stone roads grows quiet. The roar of the crowd in the Colosseum subsides. The murmur of debate in the Senate falls silent. These great figures, who once shook the world with their passions and their wars, now recede into the quiet halls of history. They become echoes, whispers in the long passage of time. Allow their stories to dissolve, leaving behind only a sense of peace. The struggles are over. The battles have been fought. The empire has fallen. All that remains is the deep, quiet calm that follows the end of a long and epic tale. Feel the weight of this history gently settle, becoming not a burden, but a soft blanket of time, covering all things in tranquility. Your own day is now over. Its triumphs and its challenges can be released. Let them drift away, just as the memories of Rome are now drifting. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to think about. There is only the stillness of this moment, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. You have traveled far, and now it is time to rest. Time for deep, peaceful and restorative sleep. There is only silence and peace.